Hello, my name is David Neal, and I'm the developer of DNA2Tree. And I want to give you a little demo of what you can do with DNA2Tree and what some of the features are. So let's get started. I'm going to log into the app. I'm going to use Facebook login, because that way I don't ever have to type. So I just log in, and I've already set this up to have a subscription. DNA2Tree is sold on a subscription basis, so if you do want to use it, you'll need to get a subscription. So DNA2Tree works with your Ancestry DNA tests. So as a first step, what you basically do is log in at Ancestry. Now I have this already set up with my account. So I'm going to log in. And then you pick a DNA kit. Most people will just have one. But since I am a search angel and I help lots of people, I have dozens. So for this demo, I'm going to show using my test kit. And that's just because of privacy things. I don't want to use someone else's kit and interfere with their privacy. So I'm going to log in as me. So the first step that you do is you need to load some DNA matches to work with. And what I'm going to do in this first case is just load a few. I'm going to load 4 pages of DNA matches. Now a page is equivalent to an Ancestry page of DNA matches, and there are 50 matches on a page. So basically what I'm going to be doing here is loading the first 200 of my DNA matches. So I then touch the load all DNA matches, and it'll start loading those 4 pages. You'll notice a pair of progress indicators. The top one indicates what page we're on. The bottom one indicates what match on the page we're on. So what this is doing is it's going to each of those matches and looking to see if they have a pedigree tree. If they do have a pedigree tree, it loads in all the people who are in that pedigree tree. So depending on how many people have trees and the size of the trees, this operation can vary. But as you can see, it's going pretty fast. We've already loaded the first 2 pages, and so we're already over 100 matches. And so in a lot of cases, you can do this in just a couple of minutes, depending on the number of pages you're loading. So what this will do, and I've actually looked at this in detail in my case, is it's now loaded the first 200 DNA matches. Now, I've got everyone in my family tested just because, well, I wanted to see what I could learn from having my kids, my cousins, my brothers. So I've got a lot of Neals that have been tested. And I've built a huge family tree that everybody leverages. So I have a lot of data about my family. But if you notice, beyond second cousins, you start getting into people, and these are people who I don't know. Some of them I figured out how I'm related to, others I'm not exactly sure. But as you can see, I've loaded the first 200 matches. Now the little tree icon indicates that they actually have people in their pedigree tree. And the number in parentheses afterwards indicates how many people are in their tree. So we've actually loaded probably about 7,000 people from this first 50 pages. So let's now look at what we can do with this information. So if we go back to the main screen, the next step after loading DNA matches is to find common ancestors. Now the whole theory here is that if 2 or more of your DNA matches share a common ancestor, that you're very likely to be related to them too, as long as that common ancestor was born far enough back so that your predicted relationship can match your actual relationship. And I'll explain more about that as we go along. But what I'm going to do now is look for common ancestors in all the pedigree trees of the people we just loaded. So I'm going to touch on find common ancestors. And so what it's doing here is it's going through those 8,000 people, comparing each one to another, trying to figure out if they're the same person. And it uses what I call a fuzzy match algorithm. So if there's slight spelling differences, slight difference in the years, it still will potentially find the common ancestor. But one of the side effects of this is occasionally it'll identify someone as the same person when in fact they're not. So when we come up with the list of common ancestors, we should think of them as hints that we need to validate further. So here we go. We've now, DNA2Tree has identified 51 common ancestors of DNA matches to me. Now, the first, say, 24 of them are coming from my immediate relatives. So that's not entirely unpredictable. So these are people who are my grandparents, my parents, cousins, so on. But then as you go down the list, you can see how some of the matches, say at number 27, this James Melvin Heck was determined through a third cousin DNA match and another third cousin DNA match. So in fact, that's not someone I recognize, and I don't know those two matches. So that's potentially a new ancestor of mine that I've not known about. Some of the others further down the list, the Lovegroves and the Moores, I know are on my maternal side of the family. And we can just go down and look through all of these. Some are born in mid-1800s, some are the 1900s, and some go all the way back to the 1700s, if you look at towards the end of the list. So these are potentially all common ancestors. And there are two reasons you might be looking for common ancestors. The first might be is that you're doing an adoptee search, either for your birth parents or you're helping someone else find their birth parents, and they have no tree to begin with. So by finding a common ancestor for your client, you now know that one of their descendants will be one of the birth parents. So those of us who are search angels, this is almost always the first step that we do in trying to do an adoptee search. Now we did this with DNA2Tree, and it took us a couple of minutes to come up with 51 different common ancestor candidates. One of the reasons I was motivated to write DNA2Tree is that previously I and others always had to do this by hand. We had to go into Ancestry, click on the pedigree trees of our closest matches, kind of eyeball them, excuse me, and look for common surnames, then check those surnames and see if we could kind of find a common relative. What this entailed is many times I would spend 4, 8, 10, 12 hours looking through hundreds of pedigree trees and hopefully find one good common ancestor. So after having done this for the nth dozen times, I was just thinking there has to be a way to automate this, which started me on this track to build this app. And what you actually see now is that not only does it not take 8, 10, 12 hours to do, it only takes a couple of minutes, but we are finding not one common ancestor, but dozens. So This is just a huge help in this first search, or the first step in doing a adoptee search. And DNA2Tree has been beta tested by over 30 members in the Search Angels organization I'm part of. And they're reporting that they've gotten great results. It's sped up and saved them many, many hours. And sometimes it's helped them solve and get a breakthrough on some of their toughest cases. So this is kind of an unfair test because I have so many close matches. So to give you a feel for how it might work for other people who don't have a lot of close DNA matches and who may not have very many people who have trees, I'm going to show a different feature of DNA2Tree that will kind of simulate that. We loaded all the DNA matches, the first 50 times 4 pages. But we also can do, the option below it is load some DNA matches. So what this feature is it allows you to try to select just those DNA matches you're interested in. It may be matches you want to focus on. It may be matches you want to ignore. So I've tried to come up with a bunch of different scenarios where you can just get those matches loaded that you want to work with. So to make this be a fair test, what I've done is I've gone and marked all my close relatives as favorites. So there's, 15 of them listed at Ancestry. So I go to Ancestry and make them be favorites. And now what I can do is I can pick the second option on this page, which is to say skip all favorite matches. So what this is going to do is it's going to skip all my close relatives, all my first cousins, and all my second cousins. And we'll only start loading third cousins or later DNA matches. So let me just touch on skip all favorite matches. So what it's doing here is it actually has to skip a bunch of things and then start loading DNA matches. It's still going to match 4 pages worth or up to 200, but it's going to skip those 15 or so of my closest relatives. So again, we're just going through each of those pages, loading the information about the DNA match and trying to load all the people in the pedigree tree of each of those DNA matches. So again, as you can see, it goes relatively fast, certainly a lot faster than the 10 hours I would spend doing this by hand. And we're now 3 pages through, and we're doing this in real time just to give you a sense of how it'll be if you try out the app. So we just have a little bit further to go, and there we have, as you can see, 187 DNA matches loaded. So that's basically the first 200 from the 4 pages minus the 13 that are my close ancestors, the close relatives. So if you see, the first one on the list is a third cousin, and everyone else is a third cousin or fourth cousin all the way down to the end of the list, or just third and fourth cousins. In the listing for each DNA match, it's showing the number of shared centimorgans and shared segments. So we go from as few as 40 up to as many as 185. And many times in an adoptee search, that's about what you get. You're always hoping for a first cousin or closer match. You're still feeling pretty good if you have a second cousin. But many times you only have third or maybe even fourth cousins. And it makes the the task a lot more difficult. But let me show you what DNA2Tree can do with even not very close matches. This time we're going to pick find common ancestors, just like we did before. So again, it's going through probably close to 8,000 names, picking out common ancestors between pairs of DNA matches. So you can see this is going pretty quick. We now have, in less than a minute, come up with 34 common ancestors just using third and fourth cousin matches. If you look at the first one on the list, I recognize that as, I think it's my great-great-grandfather. That's found in the trees of a third cousin and a fourth cousin. His wife was Johanna Wager, so it's got the pair of them first. It's got a love grove, which I know to be one of my ancestors. There's a Moore in the list. And then there's actually some names I don't recognize. There's a Doan, which I know is one of mine, a Hayton. Sometimes DNA2Tree will find a common ancestor to a pair of people who actually aren't my direct ancestors. They may be a descendant one generation from my direct ancestor. And so while this isn't as helpful when it's identified, it still might possibly be it and be a common ancestor. So DNA2Tree errs on the side of showing you matches, even if it can't know for sure that they're a direct ancestor. So again, you have to go through them and look at them and try to figure out what the possibility is. So in this case, let's say I was an adoptee and I went to a search angel and I said, help, I've only got third and fourth cousin matches. What can you do? Well, you could spend 12 hours trying to find one common ancestor, or you can use DNA2Tree and come up with dozens of potentials. And since I actually know that a number of these are my direct ancestors, I can verify that in fact it's found good data just by looking at third and fourth cousin matches. So, there's other ways to slice and dice which DNA matches you load. For instance, you can load just shared matches of people, or you can ignore shared matches of people. And so if you're not doing an adoptee search, but you're trying to fill out, say, your family tree, and you know people on your maternal side, and you want to focus on the paternal side, you can either choose people to exclude from the search, or choose people that you want to focus on by loading them as favorites or as a shared match to a favorite. There's also one option, load only distant cousins, which is sometimes helpful if you've done a thorough research on your family tree. And maybe you have some brick walls going back 4 or 5 generations. And there might be some common ancestors out there that people have found, but that you just can't look through thousands of pedigree trees. And also, Ancestry doesn't show you shared matches that are beyond fourth cousins. If they're fifth cousins or more, Ancestry won't show you them as shared matches. So if you choose the load only distant cousin matches, it'll load the first, say, 1,000 of your fifth cousins, and then go through their pedigree trees looking for common ancestors. And sometimes I've had genealogists who've used the app who have been able to make breakthroughs because DNA2Tree can just go through so many pedigrees, trees so quickly, it's sometimes able to break down a brick wall. So this app is not only good for adoptee searches when you know nothing about the client's tree, but it's also great for your tree. If you're researching yours or someone else's and it's pretty complete, but that you've got some blocks that you'd like to try to break through. Sometimes DNA2Tree can really help you. So I'm going to show a couple more features. The next one is called creating DNA color clusters. So I'm going to get that running and then tell you about it. So if you remember, we loaded 4 pages, which is 200 matches. And the color clusters works on up to 200 matches. And so it's now going through, and for each of the matches we loaded, it's finding their common ancestors. And then it's creating a set of people who are related to us, but also related to another of our matches. And then it's going to try to group them together. The whole theory is that you potentially group people that may correspond to a branch of your tree. Sometimes it's as straightforward as your 4 grandparents might turn into 4 unique, distinct clusters. Sometimes, most of the time, it's not that clear. So here is my DNA cluster chart. And again, this is only using my 3rd or greater cousins. I have this set up to show the first 100 matches. And you can see these little squares. So basically, it's very hard to read, but on the left and along the top are the list of names of those 100 DNA matches. And this is creating a matrix. If someone is matched with another person, there's a colored square showing that they're a shared match. And then the algorithm is that we try to group shared matches together, that people who are closely related to another group of people are put in one of these color clusters. One of the unique things and powerful things about DNA2Tree is while there are other apps that can build these color clusters, because DNA2Tree has already figured out your common ancestors in many cases, it can automatically label your color clusters with the surnames of the common ancestors of the DNA matches in that cluster. And it helps you figure out, is that a maternal grandparent cluster, a paternal grandfather cluster? So if you look, if you see on the first orange cluster, it's got all of these surnames. And we mentioned Lovegrove and Moore before. And I actually know those are on my mother's maternal side. The green one has no names. Underneath that, it shows Doan, which I actually know is on my father's side. And so it's already helping me figure out which clusters correspond to which branches of my tree. Some clusters don't have names. We don't have any names appended to that, but you either might want to look at them because you want to figure out more, or you just might say, well, for now I'm just going to ignore that. When there's a cluster we want to look at more, we can just touch on, say, this blue cluster in the middle, and then it brings up a more detailed view showing all the DNA matches that make up the cluster, and it shows the common ancestors that were found for that cluster. And if we're interested, we could look at any of the DNA matches who have trees. We can easily go to their tree and examine who they have in it. So for instance, I'm going to click on, say, this one, Carol and McGregor. You can bring up her tree. It shows what common ancestor she is found to be part of. And then it also shows everyone in her pedigree tree that is listed. And then we can also look in more detail at each person in her tree. So as you can see, it's very easy with DNA2Tree to, just with a couple of touches, get at just the information you want to look for. Every feature is tightly integrated in the app, and everything is just a touch or two away. The other thing we could do is, if we don't like our clusters, maybe they didn't come through just in a very clear way, is we can adjust the parameters of the clusters. If you look at the lower right, we can toggle any one of the 4 different parameters that the algorithm is using for building the tree. For instance, the first one is the number of matches. It by default shows you 100, but if that's too many or not enough, you can change it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on the minus button just to reduce the number of matches, and watch what happens. I hit minus, and in about a second, it redraws the chart, showing you what it looks like with 90 people. Again, I'm just going to keep touching this, and almost as fast as I can touch, it redraws the chart with those fewer numbers of people. So unlike some tools that do clustering, where it can take you minutes to even get one graph, DNA2Tree can produce its first one in just a few seconds, and then let you play to your heart's content to adjust the parameters. So let's go back to 100 where we started. The other parameters you can adjust are the minimum number of centimorgans and the maximum number. There's a default, but you can change that. So for instance, if you got too many matches and you want to eliminate some of them, you can increase, say, the minimum number of centimorgans. So I'm going to touch on the plus indicator under minimum CMs, and it's going to raise the number of CMs by 5. And so every time it does that, it updates the chart. Now, because when we loaded, we were eliminating all the close relatives. At first, it didn't change much because we'd already excluded some of our closer matches. But now that we're up to 55 centimorgans, notice there's a lot fewer people. There's only 62 matches being shown. So these are my more distant cousins. So if we just keep increasing that, we'll have fewer matches, and we can go down there. In this example, it doesn't make much sense to increase the maximum number of centimorgans because we already eliminated all the close matches when we loaded DNA matches. But if you loaded all of them, you could increase or decrease so as to get more of your real close matches, say your immediate family or first cousins, or to exclude more. If you want to look at one side of your tree versus another by reducing the maximum number of centimorgans, you potentially can cause the clustering to focus on just a branch of your tree you're interested in. So as you can tell, both because we can control what DNA matches we load and because we can adjust the parameters of color clustering, we can tend to tweak it until we get exactly something, a graph that allows us to maybe learn something or get some hypotheses on what we might want to do. Some of the other things you can do with this graph is you can drag and drop clusters together. So for instance, there's a green cluster towards the lower right. And if perhaps I knew what that part of my family was and I wanted to combine it, so I'm going to combine these two green clusters. So you just drag and drop, and because it's an iPad, it just adds the two together and redraws the graph immediately. So if you look at the very bottom corner, I've got, it's sort of hard to read because there's not a whole lot of space here, is some of these have names. And so, for instance, this little red square, let's see if I can do that. Sometimes it's hard to drag. Well, I won't do that. I'll drag this orange one up to this other orange one. It makes that bigger. So again, it's a way to slice and dice and combine which of your matches you want to put in which cluster. In addition, there's something I call threshold. And the challenge here is, how do you cluster and what's the algorithm? So the basic algorithm is you take your first match and you figure out who their shared matches are. And then you include the first match and all of their shared matches in a cluster. And then the next match, who isn't in a cluster, you start in the second cluster. So if we started with these 100 matches at the beginning, that was the basic algorithm. So each cluster starts with a match in their shared matches. But then there are people who it isn't as clear they're related to some of the people in the cluster, but not others. And that's what the threshold percentage allows you to toggle. At 100%, it only adds a DNA match to the cluster if that match and all of their shared matches are already in the cluster. So that's the 100%. And that's kind of the strongest way to separate into clusters. But if you notice, there's these gray things on the side, and that's where people match multiple clusters. And so one of the things you can do is either with drag or drop, you can combine them, or by decreasing the threshold percentage, it tends to combine clusters together. So I'm going to hit the negative sign on threshold percentage. Let's see what happens. So it goes down to 95. I'm just going to keep clicking that. And if you notice, the number of gray squares is tending to decrease. As I decrease the threshold, the algorithm combines different clusters into ones that are more related than others, but not at that 100% granularity. So again, you can just decrease the threshold. And what I found for my tree is if I go down to 30% or so, almost all the gray squares have disappeared because the algorithm has combined them. If you notice, for instance, though, there's this clump of gray squares at the very top corresponding to the red cluster and the blue cluster, saying that some people in each are related to the other. Well, I can just drag and drop those clusters together now. So I'm going to take that red cluster and drag it to the blue cluster. And now, since we combine those gray squares showing people that were in multiple clusters have gone away because they're all now in the same cluster. So as you can see, you can do lots of things with this. It's got the names combined. You can fix your clusters up the way you want. And it all happens very quickly and very easily. So that's DNA clusters. So now let's say you're back to your search and you've decided which of the common ancestors you're interested in working on. Let's say it's an adoptee search and you've picked out someone that looks very likely to be, say, a great-great-grandparent of the adoptee. Now you want to start building their tree of ancestry. What I would have to do, and other search angels at this point, is go to Ancestry and one by one start building their tree. Well, DNA2Tree has already figured out a bunch of information. Wouldn't it be nice if it was easy to get that information that's already been figured out into Ancestry? So DNA2Tree does have a feature. It's called Build Tree at Ancestry. So I'm going to touch Build Tree at Ancestry. What it shows me is those 34 common ancestors we found before. So I'm going to pick this first one, Giles Brown Goddard. I touch on that. It shows me the 2 DNA matches that we used to find him. One's a 3rd cousin, one's a 4th cousin. They both descend from Giles Brown Goddard, but one descends from his son, Daniel Goddard, and the other one descends from his daughter, Bethia Goddard. So now we're going to build a tree with Giles and all the descendants of Giles in the direct lineage to those 2 DNA matches. So I hit the build button. We'll name the tree. We'll call it Goddard. And then we'll hit build. So what this does is there are 28 people in this direct lineage, including spouses, between Giles Goddard and the 2 DNA matches. So export will export those people. So there we go. It's going in. Okay, so now we've exported those 28 people directly into Ancestry. And if we hit the show button, it'll actually launch a browser to this tree that we just created. So as you can see, Giles Brown Goddard is at the top of the tree, listed as a possible most recent common ancestor. There are 3 descendants. Looks like one is listed as only coming from Joanna, whereas 2 are direct descendants from both of them. So it's put them both in the tree. It's annotated the descendant line with this double helix blue icon. And then we can look at any of those descendants lines. Here's Bethia. You see how she goes down. So she goes down further until we get to the DNA match that was one of the people we used to find the common ancestor. So with this, you can find the path going to from the common ancestor down to the descendants. And also, if we do a tree search and we type in DNA, we can actually find, because those people have been annotated, the 2 DNA matches. So I'm going to look for JT, so now I can look for him, her, and there it is. It showed me that person. So you can tell it's very easy then to create a tree containing the information you have. The DNA matches are labeled with the amount of shared syndrome organs they have with the client. They're labeled with the predicted relationship, and it shows the lineage from them to the common ancestors. So it's a great way to get started on building a family tree for an adoptee if you're doing that kind of a search. So that's the overview I wanted to give of the app. Hopefully it's intrigued you. and you'd like to give it a try. I think you'll be surprised at how fast, how integrated, how versatile this app can be. So I encourage you to give it a try. It's available at the Apple App Store, and hope you enjoy it. And please contact me if you have any questions, any ideas on features, or any issues. My email address is davidneal, DAVIDNEAL, at DNA2Dreamers.com. So I look forward to hearing from you. I'm also on a number of Facebook groups. I'll try to respond to things there. But thank you for listening.